So we are on lesson 4, which is called notes in the book. I'm going to be calling it note values. And we're just going to be learning to identify and label the different note types that we'll see on the staff. So for example, whole note, half note, quarter note, eighth note. If those terms sound familiar, that's what we're going to be getting into. So we're probably going to be camping out on this topic for maybe 2 or 3 videos. The reason being, this is an area that I have found is tends to be an area where a lot of adults have learned some half-truths or literal lies along the way. And it's a really critical area, a foundational area to be clear on before we try to read music and before we try to read rhythm in particular. So I want to just make sure we're really clear at the end of these 3 videos or 2 videos, however long it takes, what information we can glean from note values and what information we cannot glean from note values. So if it seems a little pedantic, if it comes easily to you, I apologize, but I've just seen this trip people up over and over and over again. So call it PTSD, but I'm going to spend a little bit of time here. And if it's easy to you, then I'm so glad it's easy for you. That's great. And it will make understanding rhythm reading much easier. If you're a mathy person, this will probably come much more easily to you and be more intuitive. If you're not, no worries. And if you're not clear on this after 2 or 3 lessons, don't worry about it. We're going to be coming back and hitting this hard, and I'll be reviewing it a lot when we're doing rhythm again, when we're actually reading the rhythm on the page. So no worries if it's tricky. Also, feel free to ask questions. I've explained this to even really little kids, and I have lots of tricks up my sleeve for how to make the concept a little more concrete and stuff if you find you're struggling with it. So don't hesitate to ask. A lot of people need to hit this material over and over before it really sinks in. So hopefully it'll come easily to you, but if it doesn't, just ask for help. Okay, as always, since we're in the learning our alphabet sort of stage, we're going to start with review. So remember that we learned there's a staff made up of 5 lines and 4 spaces that we count from the bottom. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines and 1, 2, 3, 4 spaces. If we were to write an X at this point on line 3, it would be 1, 2, and we try to center it right over line 3. If we wanted to draw an X in space 4, we go 1, 2, 3, 4 and try to draw an X right between line 4 and 5. We learned that we have a treble clef sometimes at the leftmost side of a staff, and this clef is a sign. It's called a clef sign, and it helps us decode what pitches to assign to the notes that we're going to see on the staff. So the treble clef, also called the G clef, will start on line 2. We'll bump up to 3, down to 1, up and around. Sorry for letting that cut out. Down. There we go. And we call this the G clef because all of this action here on around line 2, surrounding line 2, helps us to know that X marks the spot, and this is a G. From there, we can assign pitches and letter names to all the other notes we're going to see on the page, or I should say on that staff and above and below it. Often this clef will be used for the female singers, for higher instruments like piccolo, flute, violin, oboe, clarinet, things like that, trumpet. And then we also have the bass clef. Bass clef can also be called an F clef because, oops, let's change color back to something normal. We could start on line 4, bump up to 5, draw half a heart, down to 2 dots here, 1 in space 4, 1 in space 3, again called the F clef because these 3 points together help us to know that this note will be an F. From there, we can figure out all the other pitches on the staff. All right, so we're going to just start by, again, reading this lesson together. Lesson 4, notes or note values. The most important musical symbols placed on a staff are called notes. The 4 most common notes are, and we have here a whole note, half note, quarter note, and eighth note. Notes tell us several things. One of the things a note tells us is how long to sing or play a sound. And we're just going to call this, the more correct term for that is just the duration of the note. Some notes last for a long time and some for a short time. Of the 4 notes shown above, a whole note is the longest and an eighth note is the shortest. It's a little bit like arithmetic. And from here, I'm just going to actually move away from this book for a minute. Nothing here is incorrect, but we're going to come back to this at the end of our lesson. All right, so we're going to start by just actually drawing out together what I'll call a note value tree. You might have seen this, especially if you've done music in school. And so I think this will be familiar, but I want to do this together because this is probably the most valuable tool for really understanding what information we can glean and what information we cannot glean from seeing a note value. So we're going to start with our good old whole note. Whole note is just an open, we call it, note head, basically just an oval shape, okay? So we call this a whole note. Right? And you might have heard this before. We could think of it as being a whole pie. Literally, we're doing fractions here. It's why it's hard for a lot of kids, because a lot of kids haven't done, fractions is still sort of a confusing topic to a lot of them. So that is the longest note, a whole note, unless we alter it, that we have in Western music. So a whole note is our longest note value, okay? We can break this whole note into 2 equal parts, and what it's going to look like is we take that same whole note, the open note head, and we just add one element. We add a stem, okay? And that is going to be the clue that helps us know this is one step down, one step smaller than a whole note. And of course, we'll call these half notes, okay? Because each of these notes will be worth half the value of a whole note, similar to half of a pie being, the equivalent to half of a whole pie, right? So again, we can split these notes into 2 equal parts. We do that in terms of symbols by taking these half notes and we add, again, one element. We make one change to it. And that's going to be that we fill the note head in. Okay, that's the clue, that's the code that we're one step farther along our breaking notes into smaller bits. So these are going to be called quarter notes because we've literally taken that whole pie, that whole note, and we've cut it into 4 equal pieces, okay? So one of these pieces would be equivalent to 1/4 of a whole note, okay? It'll have a quarter of the value or a quarter of the duration of a whole note, okay? We can, again, break these quarter notes down into 2 equal parts. And similarly, we're going to just take that quarter note, take that symbol we've established, which is a filled-in note head with a stem, okay, and we are going to either add a little flag if we want to draw one of them by themselves, or we can take those 2 flags, or sometimes even 3 of these notes in a row, or even 4 in a row, and we can just connect those 2 flags together, and we call this a beam. Then it's beamed eighth notes. So we can do groups of 2. Sometimes you'll even see groups of 4 eighth notes. Notice in this case, then it's just going to be the one beam. Those are eighth notes, one beam across, right? Or sometimes you'll see groups of 3 eighth notes with one beam across, or again, single eighth notes, okay? So, oops, just get rid of that. All right, so these guys are called, again, eighth notes, and that is because it takes 8 of them to equal the same duration, the same time value as a whole note, okay? And we'll go one level farther, and we'll break each of these eighth notes into two equal parts, right? And again, we start with an eighth note, and we're going to add one element to that notation, okay? In this case, I'm just going to beam, sorry. This is going to get a little messy. Okay, I'm going to draw these little note heads. Things are getting tiny, sorry. And I'm going to beam one across would be an eighth note. I'm going to do two across because that is the next element, the notation element we're going to add that's going to help us understand the code, that this is one level down yet from eighth notes. This is one note smaller. It has less length, less duration, okay? You might also sometimes see these, not that frequently, but as separate 16th notes, which is just an eighth note, but instead of having one flag, it has two flags hanging down, okay? So you can just think of, I always say to my students, when you see beamed 16th notes, you're really just thinking of these beams as being the flags all kind of, strung together, okay? So these are 16th notes, and I'm not going to try drawing the pie, but it would mean that each of these notes gets just 1/16 of the duration of a whole note, okay? What I want to make sure we're clear on right now, and that I will spend a little more time on in the next two videos on this lesson, is just that the only thing we can know from a note value tree like this, from notes that we see that are not yet connected to a staff where the composer has given us additional decoding information, the only thing we can know is the relative value of these notes, meaning we have not been able as of yet to actually assign a specific number of beats or a specific length of time to any one of these note values. The only thing we can say definitively and absolutely right now is that, let's say, it takes 2 half notes to equal one whole note. We can say that, right? We can also say it authoritatively that it is going to take 2 eighth notes to equal 1/4 note. And that there would be 4 quarter notes in the same length of time that it would take to play one whole note. So the only thing we know from a note value alone is its relative value compared to the notes around it. That's it. There's no specific beat allotment given to any one of these notes until we put it on a score with additional decoding information from the composer. And this is where I find a lot of adults have misunderstood it. It's a really important concept, so just start letting that sink in, and we'll beat it to death in the next two videos so it hopefully starts sticking.